The sun hung low over Bitter Creek like a dying ember, casting long shadows across the dusty frontier town where decent folks had already shuttered their windows for the night. Outside the town limits, beside a grove of weathered cottonwoods, an old man sat hunched over a small campfire that barely pushed back the gathering darkness. Thomas Garrett looked every one of his 62 years, his face carved with deep lines that spoke of too many harsh winters and harder choices. Wire-rimmed spectacles perched on his nose as he stirred beans in a dented pot, his movements slow and deliberate like a man whose joints protested each gesture. His clothes were simple worn cotton and faded denim, patched in places and bearing the dust of countless miles on forgotten trails. The flames danced across pale blue eyes that seemed almost colorless in the firelight, like winter ice or old tombstones. His gray hair hung limp beneath a battered hat that had seen better decades, and his hands trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee cup. Those hands bore the scars of hard labor, white lines crisscrossing knuckles and palms, but they shook now with what appeared to be the simple frailty of advancing years. Beside him lay his bedroll, a thick bundle wrapped in oiled canvas and tied with rawhide strips. Something heavy rested within those confines, creating an odd bulge that didn't match the usual shape of blankets and personal effects. The sound of approaching horses broke the evening stillness, and Garrett looked up with the careful attention of a man who had learned long ago that riders after dark rarely brought good news. 4 mounted figures emerged from the purple shadows, their silhouettes black against the dying light. The man in front sat his horse like he owned the world, broad shoulders filling out an expensive leather vest that caught what remained of the sun's rays. Silver conchos decorated his hat band and belt, and twin colts rode low on his hips in tooled holsters that had never known honest work. Snake Morrison was 35 years old and had never met a situation he couldn't solve with violence or the threat of it. His dark eyes held the cruel gleam of a man who enjoyed watching others squirm, and his smile revealed teeth stained brown from tobacco and too much whiskey. The 3 men flanking him were cut from similar cloth, hard cases with the lean, hungry look of wolves circling wounded prey. Their horses snorted and stamped as they formed a loose semicircle around the small campfire, and Garrett could smell the stench of unwashed bodies and rot-gut liquor carried on the evening breeze. Well, Snake drawled as he swung down from his saddle with practiced ease. What have we got here, boys? Looks like some old-timer thinks he can camp on our land without paying the proper fees. His voice carried the lazy menace of a rattlesnake coiled in shade, each word dripping with mock courtesy that fooled no one. The other men chuckled and dismounted, hands resting casually on gun butts as they spread out to block any escape routes. Garrett set down his coffee cup with steady hands and looked up at the 4 men with no expression whatsoever. "This is open range, son," he said quietly, his voice carrying the gravelly rasp of a man who had breathed too much trail dust over too many years. "No harm meant to anyone. Just passing through like any traveler has the right to do." He gestured toward his meager possessions with one scarred hand. "As you can see, I'm not exactly living in luxury here." The sound of running footsteps interrupted Snake's reply, and a young woman burst from the tree line with her calico dress torn and muddy. Rebecca Thornton was 19 years old and possessed the kind of fresh-faced beauty that frontier towns treasured like water in the desert. Her father served as minister to Bitter Creek's faithful, and she had inherited his gentle nature along with her mother's striking green eyes. Now those eyes were wide with fear as she stumbled into the circle of firelight, her blonde hair escaping from its pins and her breathing rapid with exertion. "Mister, please," she gasped, looking directly at Garrett while pointedly ignoring the 4 mounted men. "You need to get out of here right now. These men are dangerous. They've been terrorizing folks for weeks. They robbed the stage yesterday and killed the driver for sport." Her voice cracked on the last words, and she wrapped her arms around herself as if trying to hold back tremors of fear and revulsion. Snake's expression shifted from lazy amusement to cold anger in the space of a heartbeat. "Well, if it isn't the preacher's little princess," he snarled, dismounting and taking 2 quick steps toward the girl. "Seems like Daddy didn't teach you proper manners about minding your own business." Before Rebecca could react, his hand shot out and shoved her hard in the chest, sending her stumbling backward to land heavily in the dirt beside Garrett's campfire. The old man started to rise, but Snake's boot caught him in the shoulder and sent him sprawling onto his back beside his scattered possessions. "Stay down, Grandpa," Snake commanded, his voice now stripped of any pretense at civility. "This is between me and the little lady who can't keep her mouth shut. Maybe it's time someone taught her what happens to girls who go spreading tales about their betters." But before Snake could advance further, his attention was caught by Garrett's belongings scattered across the ground. Most were exactly what you'd expect from a down-on-his-luck drifter: a few clothes, some hardtack, a battered coffee pot, and some basic supplies. But that bedroll drew his eye like a magnet draws iron. It was too heavy, too carefully wrapped, and it didn't settle right when it hit the ground. Something solid and substantial rested within that oiled canvas, something that might be worth taking. "You know what, old man?" Snake said with renewed interest, his cruel smile returning as he bent to examine the mysterious bundle. "I think you've been holding out on us. This doesn't look like the possessions of some broke-down saddle tramp. Let's see what you're really carrying in here." He reached for the rawhide ties with greedy fingers, ignoring Garrett's sharp intake of breath. "Son," Garrett said from where he lay in the dirt, his voice carrying a strange quality that hadn't been there before. "You don't want what's in there. Trust an old man who's seen more trouble than you can imagine. Just take my horse and what little money I've got, but leave that bedroll be. There are some things a man's better off not knowing about." But his words only seemed to inflame Snake's curiosity and greed. The outlaw's eyes glittered with anticipation as he hefted the bundle, feeling its weight and the solid object concealed within. "Oh, I think I want it very much indeed," he said with a laugh that held no warmth whatsoever. "Especially since you seem so eager for me to leave it alone. In my experience, when an old fool gets that desperate about something, it usually means there's profit to be made." "Before we see what treasures our friend here has been hiding," Snake continued, addressing the darkness beyond their small circle of firelight where he knew other ears might be listening, "I'm curious about something. I bet we've got folks watching from all over, maybe even from places as far away as Texas or California. If you're out there listening to this tale, drop a comment and let us know what state or country you're calling home tonight. I love hearing how stories like this one travel across the miles, bringing people together around campfires real and imagined alike." Rebecca struggled to her feet, dirt streaking her torn dress and tears cutting clean tracks through the dust on her cheeks. "Please," she whispered, looking between Snake's hungry expression and Garrett's strangely calm demeanor. "Just leave him alone. He's done nothing to you, and neither have I. Can't you find it in your hearts to show mercy to folks who never did you any harm?" Snake laughed again, that same cold sound that held no trace of human compassion. "Mercy is for the weak, little girl," he said as he tucked the heavy bedroll under one arm like a prize he'd won fair and square. "And weakness is something I cure wherever I find it." His men moved closer, forming a tighter circle around the campfire as their leader prepared to unveil whatever secrets the old drifter had been carrying. Garrett remained on the ground where Snake's boot had put him, but something had changed in his posture and bearing. The trembling in his hands had stopped completely, and those pale blue eyes had taken on a different quality entirely. They no longer looked like the faded orbs of a man worn down by years and hardship. Instead, they had become winter ice, flat and cold and utterly without mercy. When he spoke again, his voice carried a new undertone that made Rebecca step back involuntarily and caused the nearest outlaw's hand to drift toward his gun. "Last chance," Garrett said simply, the words dropping into the night air like stones thrown into still water. "Walk away now, all four of you, and we can pretend this never happened. Take my horse if you want. Take what little money I've got in my pockets, but put down that bedroll and ride out while you still can. Some secrets are better left buried, and some sleeping dogs are better left to lie in peace." Snake Morrison's fingers worked eagerly at the rawhide knots binding the mysterious bedroll, his excitement building with each loosened cord. The firelight danced across his face, highlighting the cruel anticipation in his dark eyes as he finally pulled away the oiled canvas wrapping. What he found inside made his blood run cold and his hands freeze in mid-motion. There, staring back at him from a yellowed piece of paper, was his own face rendered in stark black ink above words that spelled out his doom. The wanted poster was official government issue, bearing the seal of the United States Marshal Service and printed on heavy stock that had survived countless miles of travel. Snake Morrison, it read in bold letters beneath his likeness. Wanted dead or alive for armed robbery, murder in the first degree, and assault with intent to kill. Reward $5,000. The details of his crimes were laid out in clinical precision, each bank robbery and killing documented with dates and locations that painted a picture of a man who had left a trail of blood across 3 territories. Snake's mouth went dry as the implications hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't some random old drifter he'd decided to rob for sport. This was a bounty hunter, a professional manhunter who had been tracking him for God only knew how long. The careful way the poster had been wrapped and preserved spoke of a man who took his work seriously, who had spent considerable time and effort hunting down his quarry. Snake's hands began to tremble as he realized he wasn't the predator in this situation. He was the prey, and he had just walked directly into the trap. The man lying in the dirt beside the campfire watched Snake's growing horror with those pale, emotionless eyes. Thomas Garrett had been many things in his 62 years of life, but he had never been a patient man when it came to justice. He had served as a United States Marshal for 18 years before his official retirement, and in that time, he had brought in more wanted men than any other lawman west of the Mississippi River. They had called him Cold-Eye Garrett in those days, a name earned through countless confrontations where his Arctic stare had been the last thing desperate men saw before they met their maker. 34 confirmed kills, the record books showed, though Garrett himself knew the number was higher when you counted the ones who had died slow from wounds he'd given them. Every single man had been a killer himself, a predator who had chosen to live by violence and had died by the same code. Garrett had never lost sleep over any of them, but he had grown weary of the endless cycle of hunt and kill that his badge demanded. 3 years ago, he had officially retired and tried to disappear into the anonymous life of a wandering drifter. But some men never truly leave their past behind, and when word had reached him about Snake Morrison's latest atrocity, the murder of the Henderson family, including their 2 young children, Garrett had strapped on his guns one last time. The Hendersons had been good people, homesteaders trying to build something decent in the wilderness, and they had died simply because Snake needed their horses and didn't want to leave witnesses. That kind of evil couldn't be allowed to continue drawing breath, retirement or no retirement. Snake looked up from the poster to meet Garrett's steady gaze, and what he saw there made him take an involuntary step backward. Those weren't the eyes of a frail, old man anymore. They were the eyes of a killer, flat and cold and utterly without mercy. The transformation was so complete and so sudden that Snake wondered how he could have missed it before. This was a man who had looked death in the face so many times that it held no terror for him anymore. A man who had dispensed justice with the same casual efficiency that other men used to brand cattle or shoe horses. "Boys," Snake called out to his companions, his voice cracking slightly on the words. "We might have a problem here. This ain't what it looks like. This old bastard is some kind of lawman, been hunting me with this poster." His men moved closer, hands dropping to their weapons, but Garrett could see the uncertainty creeping into their postures. They had signed on to rob travelers and intimidate shopkeepers, not to face down a legendary manhunter who had killed more men than all of them combined. Jake Morrison, Snake's younger brother and the most loyal of his followers, squinted at the poster in the flickering light. "That's your face. All right," he said slowly. $5,000 is serious money, Snake. That means this old coot is serious business. Maybe we should just ride out of here and find easier pickings somewhere else." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from the campfire, and for a moment Snake considered taking the advice. But pride and fear warred in Snake Morrison's chest, and pride won out as it always did. He had built his reputation on never backing down from anyone, and he couldn't afford to show weakness in front of his men. If word got out that he had run from one old man, every 2-bit gunfighter in the territory would come looking to make a name for himself. No, he decided, this ended here and now, one way or another. "You think you're something special, old man," Snake snarled, drawing his Colt and pointing it directly at Garrett's head. "Well, I got news for you. Dead bounty hunters don't collect rewards, and that's exactly what you're about to become." But even as he spoke the words, Snake felt a chill run down his spine. Garrett hadn't flinched when the gun came out. He hadn't even blinked. He just lay there in the dirt with that terrible calm, like a man who had been in this exact situation too many times to be impressed by amateur theatrics. Rebecca Thornton had been listening to this exchange with growing horror, her young mind struggling to process the reality of the violence that was about to unfold. She had heard stories about bounty hunters and wanted men, but they had always seemed like tales from some distant, more dangerous world. Now that world had crashed into her peaceful existence with the force of a lightning strike, and she found herself caught between a killer and the lawman who had come to stop him. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire. "There's been enough killing already. Can't you find some other way to settle this?" She looked at Garrett with desperate hope, willing him to be the reasonable man his age and apparent frailty suggested he should be. But when their eyes met, she saw only that same arctic coldness that had so unsettled Snake, and she realized with dawning terror that she was about to witness something that would haunt her dreams for years to come. Garrett finally moved, rising slowly to his feet with the deliberate care of a man who knew that sudden movements could trigger nervous fingers on gun triggers. As he stood, his entire bearing changed in ways that defied rational explanation. The stoop in his shoulders straightened, the tremor in his hands vanished completely, and his movements took on the fluid grace of a natural predator. It was as if the frail old drifter had been nothing more than a costume that he was now discarding to reveal his true nature underneath. The transformation was so complete and so unsettling that even Snake's most hardened followers began to edge backward toward their horses. This was no longer a simple robbery gone slightly complicated. This was a confrontation between apex predators, and they were smart enough to recognize that they were outclassed. But Snake himself seemed incapable of backing down, his pride and his reputation trapping him in a course of action that his survival instincts were screaming at him to abandon. "You know what your problem is, boy," Garrett said in a voice that had dropped to barely above a whisper, but somehow carried perfect clarity in the desert night. "You never learned when to cut your losses and run. That's why you're worth $5,000 to the government. And that's why you won't see another sunrise unless you make some very smart choices in the next few minutes." Instead of heeding the warning, Snake made the worst possible decision. He reached out with his free hand and grabbed Rebecca by the arm, hauling her against his chest and pressing the barrel of his gun to her temple. The girl's scream cut through the night like a blade, and Garrett's expression shifted from cold patience to something far more dangerous. "Now we're going to do this my way, old man," Snake declared with desperate bravado. "You're going to walk away from here and forget you ever saw me, or this pretty little thing is going to pay the price for your stubbornness." "Let her go," Garrett said, and his voice had become something that belonged more in a tomb than in the throat of a living man. "Last chance, boy. You've already earned your death a dozen times over, but hurt that girl, and I'll make sure it takes you a long time to die." The words fell into the silence like stones dropped into a deep well, and even the fire seemed to burn lower in response to the menace they carried. Snake's response was to backhand Rebecca across the face with enough force to split her lip and send blood streaming down her chin. The sharp crack of flesh striking flesh seemed to echo in the desert air, and when the sound faded, something fundamental had changed in the atmosphere around the small campfire. Garrett's pale eyes had become windows into an Arctic wasteland where nothing lived or moved, and his stillness had become the perfect calm that precedes a killing storm. The sound of running boots on hard-packed earth broke the deadly silence that had settled over the campfire like a funeral shroud. A young man burst from the darkness beyond the circle of firelight, his deputy's badge catching the flames as he stumbled to a halt just outside the ring of armed men. Billy Crawford was barely 22 years old and had been wearing a lawman's star for less than 6 months. But he had spent enough time studying old wanted posters and martial reports to recognize a legend when he saw one. "Sweet Jesus," Billy whispered, his voice filled with awe and terror in equal measure. "You're Thomas Garrett. Cold Eye Garrett. I read about you in the martial training manuals back in Denver. You trained half the famous Texas Rangers and cleaned up Tombstone when even Wyatt Earp said it couldn't be done." The young deputy's hand instinctively moved toward his gun, then stopped as he realized the futility of the gesture. This was a man who had faced down entire gangs single-handed and lived to write the reports. Snake Morrison felt the blood drain from his face as the implications of that name hit him like a physical blow. Every outlaw west of the Mississippi knew stories about Cold Eye Garrett, the marshal who never missed and never showed mercy to men who preyed on the innocent. The legends said he could draw and fire before most men could blink, that he had killed the infamous Black Jake Williams in a duel that lasted less than 2 seconds, and that he had once walked into a saloon full of wanted men and walked out 30 minutes later, leaving 7 bodies behind. But those were just stories, Snake told himself desperately. Tales that got bigger with each telling around campfires and in saloons where men drank too much whiskey and needed heroes to believe in. The man standing before him was just an old drifter who had gotten lucky, maybe found that wanted poster somewhere, and decided to try his hand at bounty hunting. There was no way this frail, trembling grandfather could be the legendary manhunter whose name had become synonymous with swift and certain justice. Then Thomas Garrett began to change, and Snake Morrison realized with growing horror that every story he had ever heard had been true. The transformation started with Garrett's posture. The careful stoop of his shoulders melted away like snow in spring sunshine, revealing a frame that was lean and corded with muscle despite his advanced years. His spine straightened until he stood every inch of his full 6 feet, and the tremor that had afflicted his hands vanished as completely as if it had never existed. But it was his eyes that underwent the most dramatic alteration. Where moments before they had seemed faded and watery, now they blazed with the cold fire of winter lightning. Pale blue orbs that seemed to look straight through a man's flesh and catalog every sin he had ever committed. The change was so complete and so unsettling that even Rebecca Thornton, still held prisoner in Snake's desperate grip, stopped struggling and stared in fascination. This was not the same man who had been stirring beans over a campfire just minutes before. This was something far more dangerous. A killer who had been forged in the crucible of frontier justice and tempered by years of tracking the worst men who had ever lived. His very presence seemed to alter the air around him, charging it with the promise of violence that would be swift, efficient, and utterly without mercy. "Marshal Thomas Garrett," he said in response to young Billy's awed recognition, his voice carrying the authority of 18 years behind a federal badge. 34 confirmed kills, all of them killers themselves who chose to draw iron rather than surrender to justice. "I retired 3 years ago and tried to disappear into the kind of peaceful life that decent folks deserve to live. But some evils are too great to ignore, and Snake Morrison here represents the kind of poison that needs to be cleaned out of the world." Garrett reached into his vest with movements so smooth they seemed choreographed, producing a battered leather wallet that he opened to reveal a silver marshal's star. The badge caught the firelight and threw it back in brilliant flashes, a symbol of federal authority that had been earned through blood and validated by the bodies of men who had challenged it. "I've been tracking you for 4 months, Morrison," Garrett continued, his gaze never leaving Snake's increasingly pale face. "Ever since you murdered the Henderson family up in Kansas for the crime of having horses you wanted and being in the wrong place when you needed them." "The Henderson family," Garrett said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying perfect clarity in the desert night. "James Henderson, 34 years old, shot in the back while trying to protect his wife. Mary Henderson, 29, killed while begging for the lives of her children. Little Sarah Henderson, 8 years old, and baby Samuel, not yet 2 years walking. All of them murdered because Snake Morrison couldn't be bothered to steal horses without leaving witnesses behind." Each name hit Snake like a physical blow, bringing back memories of that terrible day when desperation and cruelty had combined to create an act so heinous that even his own men had questioned it. He had told himself at the time that it was necessary, that loose ends had to be tied up to prevent pursuit. But hearing those names spoken aloud by this legendary lawman made the magnitude of his crimes real in a way that his own conscience never could. Billy Crawford's young face had gone white as fresh snow as he listened to the recitation of Snake's crimes. He had heard about the Henderson murders from other lawmen, had seen the reports that described a scene so brutal that hardened peace officers had wept like children. To be standing here now, witnessing justice finally catching up with the man responsible, filled him with a mixture of excitement and terror that made his hands shake worse than a man with palsy. You killed them for 12 horses and $47, Garrett continued, his arctic gaze never wavering from Snake's face. Then you rode into town and spent that money on whiskey and whores while their bodies were still warm in the dirt. That makes you lower than a rabid dog, Morrison, and just like a rabid dog, you need to be put down before you bite someone else. Snake's remaining followers were beginning to edge away from the confrontation, their survival instincts finally overriding their loyalty to a man who was clearly doomed. Jake Morrison, Snake's younger brother, was the last to break, but even blood ties couldn't overcome the growing certainty that they were witnessing the final moments of the Morrison gang. This wasn't a fight they could win or even survive, and every instinct they possessed was screaming at them to run while they still had the chance. Now here's how this is going to work, Garrett said, his voice taking on the tone of a man reading terms and conditions that were not open to negotiation. You're going to let that girl go, Morrison. You're going to drop your weapons and surrender yourself to federal custody. And you're going to do it in the next 30 seconds, because that's how long I'm willing to wait before I solve this problem the permanent way. Rebecca felt Snake's grip on her arm tighten as desperation and pride warred in his chest. She could smell the fierce sweat rolling off him now, could feel the tremor in his gun hand as the weight of his situation settled on him like a collapsing building. But she could also sense the stubborn refusal to accept defeat that had kept him alive through years of violent crime, and she realized with growing terror that he was going to choose death before dishonor. You're bluffing, old man, Snake said, but his voice cracked on the words like a teenager trying to sound tough. You wouldn't risk the girl's life just to take me in. That's not how lawmen work. They protect the innocent, even when it means letting the guilty get away. His gun barrel pressed harder against Rebecca's temple, hard enough to make her whimper with pain and fear. Garrett's response was to draw his own weapon with a speed that defied human comprehension. One moment his hands were empty and relaxed at his sides, and the next a gleaming Colt Peacemaker had appeared in his right fist as if summoned by magic. The gun was a work of art, its walnut grips worn smooth by years of use, and its barrel bearing the scratched initials MG and TG inside a crude heart. Those were the initials of his late wife Martha and himself, carved during their brief honeymoon before the demands of his badge had called him away to hunt monsters in human form. That's where you're wrong, Morrison, Garrett said as the firelight danced along the blue steel of his weapon. I stopped being a lawman the day I took off this badge 3 years ago. Tonight, I'm just a man with a gun who's tired of listening to rabid dogs bark threats at innocent people. You've got 15 seconds left to make the smart choice, because after that I stop caring whether you surrender or not. The countdown had begun, and everyone present knew that Thomas Garrett was not a man who made idle threats. His reputation had been built on the simple principle that he always did exactly what he said he was going to do, whether that meant bringing in wanted men alive or sending them to judgment in pine boxes. Snake Morrison had perhaps 10 seconds left to decide whether he wanted to spend the rest of his life in federal prison or the rest of eternity in whatever hell awaited men who murdered children for pocket change. Snake Morrison's response to Garrett's ultimatum was exactly what the legendary marshal had expected from a cornered animal with nothing left to lose. Instead of surrender, he began backing slowly toward where the horses were tethered, dragging Rebecca with him while keeping his gun pressed against her skull hard enough to leave an indent in her pale skin. His remaining men spread out in a ragged line between him and Garrett, their weapons drawn but their hands shaking with the knowledge that they were facing a living legend who had killed more professional gunfighters than all of them combined. You think you're so damn smart, old man, Snake snarled, spittle flying from his lips as desperation gave way to the kind of rage that comes when a predator realizes he has become prey. But I got news for you. I've been in tighter spots than this and always found a way out. Soon as I get to my horse, me and the girl are riding out of here, and if you try to follow us, I'll blow her pretty brains all over the desert floor. Garrett watched this tactical retreat with the patience of a chess master who could see 20 moves ahead. He had faced this exact scenario dozens of times during his career, desperate men using innocence as shields while they tried to find some escape route from justice. The key was to remain calm, to think 3 steps ahead of panic-driven criminals whose fear made them predictable, and to wait for the moment when their desperation would create the opening he needed. The first mistake Snake's men made was positioning themselves too close together. creating a cluster that limited their ability to spread fire and made them vulnerable to being flanked. The second mistake was allowing their attention to be divided between their leader and the legendary lawman who represented their most immediate threat. Garrett noted these tactical errors with the detached professionalism of a man who had turned violence into an art form, filing away information that would prove useful in the coming confrontation. Jake Morrison, Snake's younger brother and the most loyal of his followers, was sweating bullets despite the cool desert night. He had heard all the stories about Cold Eye Garrett, but he had never imagined he would find himself on the wrong end of the Marshal's legendary skills. The smart thing to do would be to throw down his gun and hope for mercy, but family loyalty and years of shared crime had created bonds that were not easily broken even in the face of certain death. "Boss," Jake called out without taking his eyes off Garrett's motionless form. "Maybe we should just cut our losses here. This ain't worth dying for. And that old man looks like he could put bullets through all of us before we could even clear leather. There's other towns, other scores to settle. We could be in Mexico by morning if we ride hard and don't look back." But Snake Morrison had spent too many years building a reputation as a man who never backed down from anyone to start showing weakness now. His pride had become a prison that trapped him in courses of action his survival instincts were screaming at him to abandon, and that pride would not allow him to admit that he had finally met someone he couldn't intimidate or outfight. The Henderson family murders had marked him as a child killer, and child killers had no safe harbor anywhere in the territories. "Shut your mouth, Jake," Snake snapped, his voice cracking with strain as he continued his slow retreat toward the horses. "We ain't running from one old has-been who should have been in the ground years ago. Soon as I get mounted, we're going to show this legend what happens when he messes with the Morrison gang." He punctuated his words by pressing the gun barrel harder against Rebecca's temple, drawing a whimper of pain that seemed to echo in the desert silence. That sound, that small cry of suffering from an innocent girl, was exactly what Thomas Garrett had been waiting for. In his long career as a marshal, he had learned that desperate men always made the same mistakes when they thought they held all the cards. They became overconfident, they stopped thinking tactically, and they always gave him the opening he needed to turn the tables on them. "Young lady," Garrett said, his voice carrying that same Arctic calm that had unnerved Snake from the beginning. "When I give you the word, I want you to bite down on his gun hand as hard as you can and drop straight to the ground. Don't think about it. Don't hesitate. Just do exactly what I tell you and trust that justice has finally caught up with the man who's been hurting innocent folks for too long." Rebecca's green eyes met Garrett's pale blue ones across the space between them, and she saw something there that gave her the courage she needed. This was not a man who made promises he couldn't keep, and if he said he could save her, then she was going to trust him completely. Her father had always taught her that God sometimes worked through the hands of righteous men, and looking at Thomas Garrett now, she believed she was seeing divine justice made manifest in human form. Snake realized too late that his tactical position was falling apart. His men were losing their nerve. His hostage was looking less intimidated and more determined, and the legendary marshal standing before him showed no signs of the fear or hesitation that Snake had been counting on to buy him time. Worse still, he could hear sounds from the direction of town that suggested other people were becoming aware of the confrontation, and more witnesses meant fewer options for escape. The sound that finally broke Snake's remaining composure was the distinctive click of a rifle being cocked somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight. Billy Crawford had circled wide during the standoff, and now he had positioned himself with a clear shot at Snake's back from behind a fallen log. The young deputy might not have the legendary skills of Cold Eye Garrett, but he was competent enough to put a bullet where it needed to go if the situation called for it. "You hearing that, Morrison?" Garrett said with grim satisfaction. "That's the sound of your escape routes being eliminated one by one. Deputy Crawford back there has you in his sights, and I can promise you his finger is getting mighty itchy on that trigger. Your men are about 3 seconds away from cutting and running. Your hostage is ready to fight back, and you're standing in the middle of an open space with nowhere to hide when the shooting starts." The psychological pressure was building to a breaking point, and Snake Morrison was beginning to crack under the weight of his own desperation. He had faced down dozens of men in his criminal career, but none of them had possessed the cold certainty that radiated from Thomas Garrett like heat from a forge. This was a man who had looked death in the face so many times that it held no terror for him anymore, and that fearlessness was more intimidating than any gun or badge could ever be. "Now," Garrett said simply, and Rebecca Thornton bit down on Snake's gun hand with all the strength her terror could provide, while simultaneously dropping toward the ground like a stone released from a great height. Snake screamed in pain and surprise as her teeth found the web of flesh between his thumb and forefinger, and his grip on both the girl and his weapon loosened enough to create the opening that Garrett had been patiently engineering. The legendary marshal moved with a speed and precision that belonged more in the realm of magic than mundane human capability. His first shot took Snake's gun out of his hand with surgical accuracy, the bullet striking the weapon's cylinder and sending it spinning away into the darkness like a metallic bird with broken wings. His second shot, fired before the echo of the first had faded, punched through the shoulder of the nearest gang member with enough force to spin him around and drop him face first into the dirt. Jake Morrison, loyalty warring with survival instinct, made the fatal mistake of trying to return fire instead of surrendering. His shot went wild, kicking up a spray of sand several feet to Garrett's left, and he never got a chance for a second attempt. The marshal's third bullet caught him center mass and drove him backward off his feet, his gun tumbling from nerveless fingers as he hit the ground with the boneless finality that marked the end of all earthly concerns. The remaining gang members had seen enough. These were men who lived by violence, but they possessed enough intelligence to recognize when they were outclassed by a superior predator. Without a word being spoken, they threw down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender, their faces pale with the knowledge that they had just witnessed a demonstration of skill that belonged in the realm of legend rather than reality. Snake Morrison clutched his bleeding hand against his chest and stared at Thomas Garrett with the wide-eyed horror of a man who had finally met something he couldn't bully, intimidate, or kill. The transformation from predator to prey was complete, and for the first time in his adult life, he understood what it felt like to be helpless in the face of superior force. The irony was not lost on him that this was exactly how his victims had felt in their final moments. Billy Crawford emerged from his concealed position with his rifle still trained on the surviving outlaws, his young face flushed with excitement and terror in equal measure. He had just witnessed a masterclass in tactical shooting, a display of skill so far beyond his own abilities that it seemed almost supernatural. The stories about Cold Eye Garrett hadn't been exaggerated at all. If anything, they had understated the reality of what this man could do when aroused to action. Rebecca Thornton scrambled away from Snake's reach and ran to where Garrett stood reloading his weapon with the automatic efficiency of long practice. She was shaking like a leaf in a high wind, but her eyes blazed with gratitude and admiration for the man who had saved her life at considerable risk to his own. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the campfire. "I thought I was going to die tonight, but you saved me just like the heroes in the stories my father used to read." Garrett holstered his reloaded weapon and turned those pale blue eyes on Snake Morrison, who was still crouched on the ground nursing his wounded hand and trying to process the speed with which his situation had deteriorated. The outlaw's face had gone gray with shock and loss of blood, but more than that, it reflected the dawning realization that his reputation as a dangerous man had just been exposed as nothing more than bluster and theatrics when faced with genuine professional competence. "Stand up, Morrison," Garrett commanded in a voice that brooked no argument. "You've got a date with a federal judge, and I intend to make sure you keep that appointment. But first, you're going to tell me where you buried the Henderson family, because they deserve better than an unmarked grave in some godforsaken canyon where the buzzards picked their bones clean." Snake Morrison struggled to his feet on unsteady legs, his wounded hand leaving a trail of blood drops in the sand like a crimson breadcrumb path leading straight to his downfall. For a moment, it looked like he might try to make one final desperate play, perhaps grab for a concealed weapon or attempt to rush the marshal who had destroyed everything he had built through years of violence and intimidation. But when he met Thomas Garrett's Arctic gaze one final time, Snake Morrison finally understood that he was looking at his own death if he made any more aggressive moves. This was not a man who would hesitate to kill if the situation required it. and Snake had already provided more than enough justification for a permanent solution to the problem he represented. Instead of fighting, he slowly raised his good hand in a gesture of surrender that marked the end of his career as one of the territory's most feared outlaws. The news of the confrontation spread through Bitter Creek like wildfire through dry grass, and within minutes the main street had filled with townspeople eager to witness what promised to be the final chapter in Snake Morrison's bloody career. Word had gone out that the legendary Cold Eye Garrett was in town, that he had tracked down one of the territory's most wanted killers, and that justice was finally going to be served in the old-fashioned way that frontier folk understood and respected. Sheriff Wade Hutchins was a good man in his 50s who had kept the peace in Bitter Creek for over a decade, but he knew his limitations when it came to facing down professional killers. When Billy Crawford came running into his office with news that Thomas Garrett himself was about to settle accounts with Snake Morrison, Hutchins made the smart decision to stay out of the way and let federal authority handle federal business. Some situations called for local law enforcement, and others required the kind of legendary skills that ordinary peace officers simply didn't possess. The sun was beginning its final descent toward the western horizon, painting the dusty street in shades of gold and crimson that seemed appropriate for the violence that was about to unfold. Garrett walked slowly down the center of the main thoroughfare, his spurs ringing against the hard-packed earth with each measured step. He carried the wanted poster in his left hand, holding it up so that everyone present could see Snake Morrison's face and the $5,000 bounty that had been placed on his head by the federal government. "Ladies and gentlemen," Garrett called out in a voice that carried to every corner of the assembled crowd, "this man is wanted for multiple counts of murder, including the killing of an entire family up in Kansas. James and Mary Henderson and their 2 young children were shot down in cold blood for the crime of owning horses that Snake Morrison wanted to steal. Tonight justice catches up with him, one way or another." The crowd murmured and shifted as they absorbed this information, their faces reflecting the mixture of anticipation and dread that always accompanied public violence. These were decent people for the most part, hardworking settlers who had come west seeking opportunity and freedom, but they lived in a harsh land where sometimes the only law that mattered was the kind that came from the barrel of a gun. They had suffered under Morrison's reign of terror for months, losing friends and neighbors to his casual brutality, and now they were finally going to see him answer for his crimes. Snake Morrison stood at the far end of the street, his wounded hand roughly bandaged with a strip torn from his own shirt. The bleeding had mostly stopped, but the throbbing pain served as a constant reminder of how quickly his situation had deteriorated from predator to prey. Behind him lay nothing but empty desert, and ahead of him stood a legend whose reputation had been built on the graves of men who had thought themselves tough enough to challenge federal authority. The outlaw's remaining followers had either fled into the night or surrendered to Deputy Crawford, leaving Snake completely alone for the first time in years. Without his gang to provide backup and intimidation, he felt naked and vulnerable in a way that was entirely foreign to his experience. He had built his entire adult life around the principle that violence and the threat of violence could solve any problem, but now he faced a man who possessed both skills and measures that far exceeded his own. "You don't have to do this, old man," Snake called out, his voice carrying a note of desperation that he couldn't quite suppress. "We could work something out, maybe split that bounty money and call it even. I got information about other wanted men, locations of hideouts, names of folks who've been dealing with stolen goods. That kind of intelligence has got to be worth something to a man in your line of work." Garrett's response was to carefully fold the wanted poster and tuck it inside his vest, right next to the marshal's badge that had defined so much of his adult life. The gesture was deliberate and final, a symbolic rejection of any possibility for negotiation or compromise. Some crimes were too heinous to be bargained away, and the murder of children for pocket change placed Snake Morrison firmly in that category. "The only information I need from you, Morrison, is where you buried the Henderson family," Garrett replied in that same Arctic tone that had been chilling men's blood all evening. "After you're dead, I'll be searching your camp and questioning anyone who rode with you until I find out where you put them. Those people deserve a proper burial in consecrated ground, not some unmarked hole in the desert where the animals can get at their remains." Snake felt sweat breaking out across his forehead despite the cooling evening air. He had faced death before, had killed men and been shot at in return, but this was different. This was facing a professional, a man who had turned killing into an art form and who possessed the kind of cold certainty that came only from years of dealing with the worst humanity had to offer. Snake's hands began to shake as he realized that all his years of violence and intimidation had been nothing more than preparation for this moment. The crowd had formed a rough circle around the two men, giving them plenty of room while ensuring they had front-row seats for what promised to be a legendary confrontation. Rebecca Thornton stood with her father near the steps of the church, her hand clutched tightly in his as they watched the drama unfold. The minister's face was pale with tension, but his eyes reflected the same grim satisfaction that marked most of the assembled townspeople. Justice had been too long delayed, and now it was finally at hand. Billy Crawford positioned himself near the saloon with his rifle ready, not because he expected to intervene in the duel, but because he wanted to ensure that no surprises emerged from the shadows to interfere with the proceedings. This was Thomas Garrett's show, a demonstration of the kind of legendary skills that young lawmen could only dream of possessing, and Billy was determined to learn everything he could from watching a master at work. As the two men faced each other across 50 feet of dusty street, Snake Morrison made one final desperate attempt to rattle his opponent's legendary composure. "I heard about your family, old man," he called out with the cruel smile that had terrorized innocents across 3 territories. "Your wife Martha and that boy of yours, little Tommy. Word is they died while you were off playing hero somewhere, chasing men like me instead of being home where a husband and father belonged." The effect of those words on Thomas Garrett was immediate and terrifying. His pale blue eyes became windows into an Arctic hell where nothing lived or moved, and his entire body went still with the kind of perfect calm that preceded explosive violence. When he spoke, his voice had become something that belonged in a tomb rather than in the throat of a living man, each word falling into the desert silence like stones dropped into a deep grave. "Their names don't belong in your mouth, Morrison," Garrett said, and the crowd instinctively stepped back as they felt the menace radiating from him like heat from a forge. "Martha died of fever while I was tracking the Dalton gang, and Tommy was killed by a horse that spooked during a thunderstorm. Neither of them died because of men like you, but they're both buried in ground that's too good for the likes of killers who murder children for sport." Snake Morrison realized too late that his attempt at psychological warfare had backfired spectacularly. Instead of rattling his opponent, he had awakened something even more dangerous than Cold-Eye Garrett's professional competence. He had awakened the personal fury of a man who had lost everything that mattered to him and had nothing left to lose in return. The outlaw's mouth went dry as he recognized that he was no longer facing just a legendary lawman, but a father and husband whose grief had been transformed into something deadly and implacable. "Draw your iron, Morrison," Garrett commanded, his hand hovering near the grip of his Colt Peacemaker with the relaxed readiness of a man who had performed this same ritual dozens of times before. "You've earned your death 100 times over, and I'm tired of listening to you breathe air that better men deserve to have. Make your play, and let's finish this the way it was always going to end." The silence that settled over the main street of Bitter Creek was so complete that the sound of wind moving through the wooden buildings seemed as loud as thunder. Every person present understood that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for decades to come, a confrontation between legend and reality that would either confirm or destroy the reputation of one of the most famous lawmen who had ever lived. The very air seemed to vibrate with tension as two men prepared to settle their differences in the oldest and most final way possible. Snake Morrison's hand moved toward his backup weapon, a short-barreled Colt that he had kept hidden beneath his vest throughout the evening's confrontations. His wounded right hand was too damaged for accurate shooting, but his left hand was steady enough for close-range work, and desperation had given him the kind of reckless courage that sometimes allowed inferior gunfighters to triumph over superior opponents through sheer luck and determination. But luck was something that Thomas Garrett had learned not to depend on during his long career as a federal marshal. His draw was a thing of beauty, a fluid motion that seemed to defy the laws of physics as his weapon appeared in his hand with supernatural speed. The movement was so smooth and practiced that it looked almost effortless, the result of thousands of hours of practice and decades of experience facing men who wanted nothing more than to put bullets through his heart. Snake's shot came first, fired in panic as he realized that he was facing skills far beyond his own ability to counter. The bullet went wide, shattering the front window of Murphy's saloon and sending glass cascading onto the wooden sidewalk in a shower of crystalline fragments that caught the dying light like scattered diamonds. His second shot never came, because Thomas Garrett's bullet found its target with the surgical precision that had made him legendary throughout the Western Territories. The Marshal's shot took Snake Morrison directly through the heart, the bullet punching through flesh and bone with enough force to lift the outlaw off his feet and send him crashing backward into the dust of the street. He was dead before his body hit the ground, his eyes staring sightlessly at the darkening sky above as blood pooled beneath him in the sand. The wanted poster that Garrett had been carrying fluttered down from where it had been tucked in his vest, coming to rest beside Snake's outstretched hand like a final piece of evidence in a case that had been closed with permanent finality. Thomas Garrett walked slowly to where Snake Morrison's body lay cooling in the desert evening, his smoking weapon still held ready in case any final surprises remained to be dealt with. He knelt beside the corpse and pressed 2 fingers against the outlaw's neck, confirming what everyone present already knew. Snake Morrison's reign of terror was over, ended by a single bullet fired by a man whose reputation for accuracy had proven to be entirely justified. The Marshal holstered his weapon and retrieved the wanted poster, folding it carefully before tucking it back inside his vest. In his mind, he added Snake Morrison's name to the list of men he had killed in the service of justice, bringing the total to 35 confirmed kills. Each name was burned into his memory along with the circumstances of their death, a roster of violence that he carried with him like a cross that grew heavier with each passing year. Sheriff Hutchins finally approached, his face reflecting the awe and gratitude that marked most of the assembled townspeople. "Marshal Garrett," he said formally, extending his hand in a gesture of respect and professional courtesy. "On behalf of the people of Bitter Creek, I want to thank you for bringing this killer to justice. Snake Morrison and his gang have been terrorizing folks for months, and we didn't have the resources or skills to deal with them ourselves." Garrett shook the sheriff's hand and nodded toward Billy Crawford, who was approaching with his rifle still held at ready. "Your deputy there showed good judgment and steady nerves tonight, Hutchins," he said in a voice that had returned to something approaching normal human ranges. "You might want to think about recommending him for promotion, because he's got the makings of a good lawman if he stays alive long enough to learn the trade." The crowd began to disperse as the drama reached its conclusion, people heading back to their homes and businesses with the satisfied feeling that came from seeing justice served in the most direct and final way possible. But the images of what they had witnessed would stay with them for the rest of their lives, stories to be told around campfires and in saloons for decades to come. They had seen a legend in action, had watched Cold-Eye Garrett demonstrate why his name was spoken with equal measures of fear and respect throughout the Western Territories. As darkness settled over Bitter Creek like a comfortable blanket, Thomas Garrett stood alone in the middle of the dusty street where he had just ended another human life in the service of justice. The weight of 35 killings pressed down on his shoulders like a physical burden, and he wondered once again whether the peace he sought would ever be possible for a man with so much blood on his hands. But then he thought of the Henderson family, of their unmarked graves somewhere in the desert, and he knew that some evils were too great to be allowed to continue drawing breath regardless of the cost to those who stood against them. 3 weeks had passed since the sound of gunfire echoed through the main street of Bitter Creek, and the town had settled into the kind of peaceful routine that folks had almost forgotten was possible. Snake Morrison's body lay buried in the unhallowed ground reserved for killers and thieves, his grave marked only by a simple wooden cross that bore his name and the date of his death. The rest of his gang had been shipped off to territorial prison or had simply vanished into the wilderness, their appetite for violence considerably diminished by witnessing their leader's fate at the hands of a living legend. Thomas Garrett sat in the office of Territorial Judge Harrison Wells, watching as the elderly magistrate counted out $5,000 in gold coins and federal banknotes onto the scarred wooden desk between them. The bounty money felt heavier than it should have, weighted down by the knowledge of what it had cost to earn it. 35 men had died by Garrett's hand over the course of his career, and while every single one of them had been a killer who had chosen violence over surrender, the accumulated weight of those deaths pressed down on his soul like stones in a deep grave. Marshall Garrett, Judge Wells said with the formal courtesy that marked all his dealings with federal law enforcement, "This represents the full bounty placed on Snake Morrison's head by the territorial government. The paperwork is all in order, witnessed by Sheriff Hutchins and Deputy Crawford, and I've included a letter of commendation that should help if you ever need to verify your service record for pension purposes." Garrett nodded and swept half the money into a leather pouch that he tucked inside his vest, leaving the remaining $2,500 stacked on the desk in neat piles. "That portion goes to Reverend Thornton for the new church he's been trying to build," he said in the quiet voice that had become familiar to the people of Bitter Creek over the past weeks. "A man who murders children for pocket change doesn't deserve to have his death provide profit for anyone, but maybe some good can come from it if the money helps decent folks worship in proper surroundings." The judge raised an eyebrow at this unexpected display of generosity, but he made no comment as he swept the donated money into a different pouch that would find its way to the grateful minister before the day was out. Thomas Garrett's reputation for integrity was as legendary as his skill with a gun, and if he said the money should go to the church, then that's exactly where it would end up regardless of how much good it might do in other hands. From the judge's office, Garrett rode north toward the desolate canyon where Snake Morrison had hidden the bodies of the Henderson family after murdering them for their horses and the pitiful sum of $47. It had taken 2 days of searching and the reluctant cooperation of one surviving gang member, but the graves had finally been located in a rocky depression that provided some shelter from the desert wind. The outlaw had been too lazy to dig proper graves, simply covering the bodies with stones and sand in a manner that showed complete contempt for the people he had killed. Garrett had spent another full day reburying the Henderson family in proper graves, fashioning crosses from desert ironwood, and carving their names with the blade of his skinning knife. James Henderson, loving husband and father. Mary Henderson, devoted wife and mother. Sarah Henderson, beloved daughter taken too soon. Samuel Henderson, innocent child of God. The words were simple, but they restored some measure of dignity to people who had died for no better reason than being in the wrong place when a killer needed their possessions. Now he knelt beside those graves in the morning stillness, placing wildflowers he had gathered during his ride across the carefully mounded earth. The desert had already begun to reclaim the site, with hardy plants taking root in the disturbed soil and insects beginning to establish the kind of ecosystem that would eventually transform this place of death into something that supported life. It was a reminder that the natural world had its own methods for healing the wounds that human violence created. The folded wanted poster emerged from his vest pocket as he knelt beside little Samuel's grave, the paper worn and creased from weeks of travel, but still bearing Snake Morrison's image and the list of his crimes. "Justice has been served," Garrett said quietly, his words carried away by the desert wind like smoke from a dying campfire. "The man who killed you is dead, and he died knowing exactly what he had done and why he was being punished for it. I hope that brings you some peace, wherever your souls have gone to rest." He buried the wanted poster in the soft earth beside the graves, a symbolic gesture that marked the end of his hunt and the closing of a case that had brought him out of retirement one final time. Snake Morrison's reign of terror was over. His name would be forgotten by history, and the innocent people he had murdered could rest knowing that their killer had paid the ultimate price for his crimes. The ride back to Bitter Creek gave Garrett time to think about the future that stretched out before him like an unmarked trail leading into unknown country. For 18 years, his life had been defined by the federal badge he carried and the responsibility it represented to hunt down men who chose to live outside the law. But that chapter was ending, and he found himself uncertain about what came next for a man whose only real skill involved the efficient application of violence against those who deserved it. Rebecca Thornton was waiting for him when he returned to town, her green eyes bright with the kind of hope that only young people possessed in sufficient measure to believe that the world could be fundamentally changed by the actions of good men and women. She had spent the weeks since her rescue helping her father tend to the spiritual needs of a community that was still recovering from months of terror, but Garrett could see that she had been thinking about larger questions of justice and law enforcement. "Marshal Garrett," she said as he dismounted outside the church where Reverend Thornton was supervising the construction of a new bell tower funded by Snake Morrison's bounty money. "I've been talking with my father and some of the other townspeople, and we have a proposition for you. Bitter Creek needs a permanent lawman, someone with the experience and skills to keep the peace and make sure that men like Snake Morrison never get another chance to terrorize innocent folks." Garrett removed his hat and ran scarred fingers through graying hair that had begun to show white at the temples. The offer was generous and probably sincere, but it came 20 years too late for a man who had already given the best parts of himself to the service of justice. "Too much blood on these hands for holy ground, miss," he replied with a sad smile that didn't quite reach his pale blue eyes. "A man who's killed 35 people, even in the service of the law, doesn't belong in a peaceful place where children play and families try to build something decent together." "But that's exactly why we need you," Rebecca protested, her voice carrying the passionate conviction of youth confronting the hard realities of an unforgiving world. "You've proven that evil can be stopped, that killers can be brought to justice, and that innocent people don't have to live in fear of men who choose violence over decency. Stay here, help us build something better, and let this be the place where Thomas Garrett finally finds the peace he's been searching for." The marshal shook his head slowly, his decision already made during the long hours of writing and thinking that had followed his visit to the Henderson graves. "This was my last hunt, miss," he said with the finality of a man who had reached the end of a very long and bloody road. "I came out of retirement because children had been murdered, and that's not something a decent man can ignore regardless of how tired he might be of dealing with killers and their consequences. But Snake Morrison was the last, and now it's time for other folks to carry the badge and fight the fight." Billy Crawford had been listening to this conversation from the church steps, his young face serious with the weight of responsibilities he was only beginning to understand. When Garrett turned toward him, the deputy straightened instinctively, recognizing that something significant was about to happen. "You showed good judgment and steady nerves during the confrontation with Morrison," Garrett said as he reached into his vest and withdrew the silver marshal's badge that had defined so much of his adult life. The badge felt warm in his palm, heated by years of contact with his body and polished smooth by countless miles of travel in the service of federal law. "Billy Crawford," he continued formally, "I'm recommending to Judge Wells that you be appointed as the new territorial marshal for this district. You've got the makings of a good lawman if you stay alive long enough to learn the trade, and this town needs someone who understands that justice sometimes requires more than just good intentions and a willingness to compromise." Billy accepted the badge with hands that trembled slightly, understanding that he was being entrusted with something far more valuable than mere metal and authority. This represented a legacy of service that stretched back through decades of dangerous work, and he was being asked to continue a tradition that had been built on the graves of men who had chosen evil over good. "I'll honor this badge, Marshal Garrett," he said with the solemn intensity of a man taking sacred vows. "I'll protect the innocent and hunt down the guilty, and I'll make sure that folks like the Hendersons never die unavenged again." Garrett nodded with satisfaction, recognizing the same commitment to justice that had driven him through 18 years of federal service. The badge would be in good hands, and Billy Crawford would learn through experience the same hard lessons about violence and its consequences that had shaped Thomas Garrett into the legend he had become. Some knowledge could only be gained through blood and sacrifice, but the young deputy would figure that out soon enough when he faced his first real test. Reverend Thornton emerged from the church as this ceremony of succession was taking place, his gentle face marked by the gratitude and respect that had characterized his relationship with the man who had saved his daughter's life. "Marshal Garrett," he said with the formal courtesy that clergymen reserved for discussions of serious matters, "I hope you'll allow me to offer you whatever spiritual counsel might help ease the burden you've been carrying for so many years." The two men walked together toward the small cemetery behind the church, where wooden crosses marked the resting places of folks who had lived and died in the hard country that demanded everything from those who tried to build something decent in the wilderness. "Reverend," Garrett said finally, "I've been thinking about something that Snake Morrison said before I killed him, about how I wasn't home when my family needed me, because I was off chasing men like him. That's a burden that many good men carry. The minister replied with the understanding that came from years of counseling people who had lost loved ones to the violence and hardship of frontier life. The question isn't whether you made mistakes or whether different choices might have led to different outcomes. The question is whether you used the talents God gave you in service of something larger than yourself. And I think the answer to that question is pretty clear. Garrett stopped walking and looked back toward the town where people were going about their daily business without fear of being robbed or murdered by men like Snake Morrison. Some men are born to violence, Reverend, he said quietly. Others choose it because they enjoy inflicting pain and suffering on folks who can't fight back. But a few of us choose it so that others don't have to, so that children can play in the streets and families can sleep peacefully at night without wondering if killers are going to kick down their doors. I think God understands the difference, Reverend Thornton replied with the gentle wisdom that had made him a source of comfort for his congregation during the darkest days of Morrison's reign of terror. And I think Martha and Tommy would be proud of the man you've become and the lives you've saved through your service. The peace you're looking for isn't something you'll find in a place, Marshall. It's something you'll find when you finally forgive yourself for being human in a world that often demands more than any one man should have to give. 2 days later, Thomas Garrett loaded his few possessions onto the back of a sturdy pack horse and prepared to ride west toward the new life he had purchased with 25 years of federal service and a pension that would allow him to live quietly on a small ranch in California. The land was good for raising horses, the climate was mild, and the nearest neighbor was far enough away to provide the solitude that a man needed when he wanted to forget about the 35 names that were burned into his memory. Billy Crawford stood beside the church where the new bell tower was nearing completion, the silver marshal's badge pinned to his vest catching the morning sunlight like a promise of justice to come. "Marshal Garrett," he called out as the legendary lawman prepared to mount his horse and ride away from the last chapter of his career in law enforcement. "I want you to know that I'll tell stories about what you did here, about how you saved this town and made it safe for decent folks to live in peace." Garrett touched the brim of his hat in a final salute to the young man who would carry on the work of hunting down killers and protecting the innocent. "Just remember that justice isn't about being the fastest gun or the toughest man, Deputy," he said with the gravity of someone passing on hard-won wisdom. "It's about being willing to stand between evil and the folks who can't protect themselves, even when that choice costs you everything you thought you wanted from life." The sun was climbing toward its noon position when Thomas Garrett finally rode out of Bitter Creek, heading west toward mountains that promised cooler air and the kind of peace that only came to men who had finally laid down their weapons and walked away from the violence that had defined their existence. Behind him, the town settled into the rhythm of normal life, secure in the knowledge that evil had been defeated and that justice had been served in the old-fashioned way that frontier people understood and respected. If you've stayed with me through this tale of justice and redemption, I hope you'll take a moment to think about what you would be willing to sacrifice to protect the people you care about. What would you risk to stand between innocent folks and the kind of evil that Snake Morrison represented? Drop a comment below and let me know where you're listening from and what this story meant to you. Stories like this one remind us that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to do what's right even when the cost might be everything you have to give. 20 years later, when Deputy Billy Crawford had become Marshal Crawford and had trained a new generation of lawmen in the art of protecting the innocent, he would still tell stories about the 3 weeks when Cold Eye Garrett had come to Bitter Creek and reminded everyone what real justice looked like. The church bell that rang each Sunday was paid for with blood money transformed into something sacred, and the peace that settled over the town was purchased with the kind of violence that only legendary men possessed the skill and will to deliver. Thomas Garrett had ridden west into history, but his legacy lived on in the lives he had saved and the evil he had eliminated from a world that desperately needed more men willing to pay the price that justice sometimes demanded.